Recall from Chapter 2 that in correlational research, such as the studies of media violence and aggression, researchers must take into account variables that weren't measured but that might be responsible for the observed association between two variables. For example, if you find the amount of ice cream people eat is associated with the likelihood of violent behavior, you'd wisely attribute such an association to a third variable described in this chapter, hot weather. People eat more ice cream and engage in more violent behavior when it's hot, the third variable, so the apparent relationship between eating ice cream and violence is false, produced by some other cause. What unmeasured variables, then, might produce the association between media exposure to violence in childhood and later aggressive behavior? Chris Ferguson and his colleagues have noted a few such variables, 2010. In the studies of interest, researchers rarely, if ever, control for how depressed the child is, and depression is known to predict both aggressive behavior and the consumption of media violence. Further, rarely do studies measure aggressive behavior in the child's peer group, yet kids who hang around aggressive peers are almost certainly more likely to play violent video games and to engage in aggressive behavior. When these unmeasured variables, the depression of the child and the aggression of the peer group, are controlled for, the association between playing the games and subsequent aggression is reduced significantly. Let's consider another unmeasured variable that's typically not assessed, the level of violence in the family. It's well established that a violent family atmosphere, where cruel comments, harsh punishment, and physical and emotional abuse are daily occurrences, is one of the strongest predictors of children acting out in aggressive ways. And a violent family environment is also associated with the tendency to consume violent media. Yet few, if any, studies have measured the degree to which the family environment is hostile, leaving open the possibility that this might be responsible for the observed association between playing violent video games and later aggression. The same point can be made, of course, about violent TV shows and movies. As always, controversy and criticism pave the way for more rigorous science and sharper answers to the questions that matter. Income inequality. We've seen that short-term factors, such as hot weather and exposure to violent media, can lead to higher levels of aggression, and social conditions such as an individual's experience of social rejection or family violence can as well. Increasingly, social psychologists are turning their attention to whether more enduring conditions in a person's life influence levels of aggression, such as the presence of parks and green spaces in the neighborhood or prevailing economic conditions. Let's consider one such economic factor: society's level of income inequality, or the degree to which the wealthy differ from the poor in their yearly income and net wealth. Some countries are characterized by high economic inequality. The highest paid professionals, CEOs, lawyers, and financial managers have vastly more annual income than the average worker. The United States is characterized by extreme inequality. As you can see in Figure 13.2, income inequality in the United States is higher than in every European country and is exceeded by only a few countries, such as the Republic of the Philippines, Venezuela, and South Africa. Figure 13.2. Income inequality and homicide rates. Homicides are more likely in countries where there is greater income inequality between the rich and the poor, 2011. Okay, so this is a scatter plot. On the x-axis is income inequality between 0.20 to 0.60, and on the y-axis is homicides per 100,000 from negative 0.5 to 2. And some countries somehow are in the negative homicides per 100,000. I'm not sure how. Okay, so high on both inequality and homicides, the top would be South Africa. And then Chile is very high on income inequality, but not that many homicides. In Venezuela and the Dominican Republic, there's a lot of income inequality and a lot of homicides. So moving in more, you can see the USA is actually kind of an outlier. It has more income inequality than the big chunk of first world countries, and it has more homicides per 100,000 than when you move to the lower end of both income inequality and homicides per 100,000 You see this big cluster of first world countries like Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, Israel, South Korea, UK, Czech Republic, Croatia, Canada, Portugal, Hungary, Slovenia, France, Poland, Taiwan, Germany, New Zealand, Spain, Australia, Denmark, Netherlands, Ireland, Norway, and Japan. So the US is most similar to basically like Latvia, which is close actually, and Uruguay, and the Philippines, and actually kind of close to Russia. The US actually has slightly more income inequality than even Russia, and Russia has more homicides per 100,000 than the US. Is economic inequality associated with increased violence? To explore this question, researchers measured the degree of inequality indicated by differences between the relatively wealthy in a society, usually the top 20%, and the relatively poor, usually the bottom 20%, in various regions of the world, 2009. They then looked at whether regional inequality, by country, state, or county, correlates with the prevalence of different kinds of violence. Indeed, it does. In countries characterized by high income inequality, such as Venezuela, South Africa, and the United States, the average citizen is much more likely to be murdered, assaulted, or raped than in countries with less economic inequality, such as Japan, Ireland, and Norway. See Figure 13.2 for the relationship between inequality and homicide, which we just looked at. It does look like the correlation might be about 0.6. There does seem to be some positive correlation between income inequality and homicides per 100,000, which is correlational. In addition, children in countries with greater income inequality are more likely to experience conflict with their peers and to report being victims of bullying. This pattern emerges as well when states within the United States are classified according to their levels of economic inequality. Rates of homicide, for example, are higher in states with relatively high inequality, such as Louisiana and California, than in those with lower inequality, such as Utah and Wisconsin. On an even smaller scale, inequality also seems to play a role in determining which neighborhoods are more violent. There are higher rates of violence in urban neighborhoods in the United States with high income inequality than in neighborhoods with lower income inequality. 2001. Why might income inequality give rise to aggression? Social psychologists have provided several explanations. Wilkinson and Pickett, 2009, found that the powerful feelings of social rejection that those at the bottom experience in unequal societies can trigger violence, a claim supported by our earlier discussion of social isolation and rejection. Another possibility is that inequality undermines feelings of well-being, trust, and goodwill among people, which can give rise to frustration, anger, and, ultimately, aggression, as we will explore in the next section. Consistent with this idea, researchers have found that during times of growing economic inequality in a country, citizens are less happy, experience greater physical pain, and feel less trusting of others. These feelings, in turn, wear down the social fabric and so may increase the likelihood of aggression. Finally, evolutionary psychologists Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, and Sean Vazdev, 2001, offer another possibility, contending that inequality throws males into more intense competition for economic resources and access to mates, two sources of conflict that often motivate murder and other crimes. Looking back, many situational factors contribute to the likelihood of aggressive behavior. These include hot weather, violence in the media, violent video games, social rejection, and economic inequality. Box 13.3, focus on the environment. Green neighborhoods make more peaceful citizens. The current environmental movement was inspired by philosophers Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who were known as transcendentalists. These writers found great calm and peace in being out in the woods. Their writings inspired a young naturalist, John Muir, whose experiences as a young man in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California led him to found the Sierra Club and lobby on behalf of state and national parks, which he helped create. Social psychologists have recently begun to examine how easy access to nature and green spaces influences our psychological health. Recent experiments have found, for example, that a walk in the woods, as opposed to a walk through a town, enables adults to perform better on a measure of concentrated attention, 2008. Experiences in nature are the best predictor, compared with other recreational activities, of calming down from the stress of work. In geographical regions where people have greater access to beautiful green spaces, people tend to report greater happiness and goodwill toward others. These findings raise a question: might green spaces decrease neighborhood violence? Social psychologist Francis Kuo thinks so. In one line of research, Kuo studied police reports of violence occurring near 98 low-rise buildings that are part of the Ida Wells housing project in Chicago, 2001. Some of the buildings were surrounded by trees and lawns, others by asphalt and a lack of greenery. The residents in these 98 buildings came from similar backgrounds, were enduring similar levels of unemployment and economic hardship, and had been randomly assigned to the buildings they lived in. Kuo discovered that the likelihood of violent crimes was lower near apartments surrounded by green spaces. In experimental research, Kuo allowed children with attention deficit disorder, who are more prone to aggressive acts, to go for a walk of comparable length and physical exertion in one of three places: a green park, a quiet neighborhood, or noisy downtown Chicago. She found that children scored better on a measure of concentration only after the walk in the park. Green spaces seem to calm people's minds, enabling them to concentrate more effectively and better handle the frustrations of daily living. Being outdoors and physical and mental health. Urban areas that include green spaces encourage greater calm and civility and less aggression. Construal processes and aggression. We've seen that some circumstances encourage aggression. Situations, however, do nothing by themselves to incite aggression. It is how people construe situations that matters. Most people who live in extremely hot environments, see lots of violent images in movies or in video games, or encounter social rejection and income inequality do so without acting aggressively. Let's explore how particular construals of such states as feeling excessively hot and being socially isolated might lead to aggressive behavior. Anybody can become angry, that is easy, but to be angry with the right person and to the right degree and at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power and is not easy. Aristotle. Anger. For centuries, social theorists have known that anger leads to aggression. Leonard Berkowitz has offered a detailed theoretical account of the role of construal in the relationship between anger and aggression. He argues that any unpleasant stimulus can trigger a fight or flight response of anger. This is true of more obvious causes of aggression, such as being exposed to violent images in the media, living in a neighborhood defined by income inequality and poverty, and being insulted, as well as such factors as physical discomfort, hunger, and feelings of shame and depression. Once angry, people are more likely to think things are unfair, to perceive others as having more combative intentions, and to imagine ways of inflicting harm. This line of thinking helps clarify when aspects of a situation will lead to anger and aggression. For instance, sometimes hot weather doesn't trigger anger. It could very well prompt relaxation in the hammock instead, and thus won't lead to aggressive behavior. Other times, though, the discomfort of extreme heat will stimulate anger, thereby making people more prone to acting aggressively. In one provocative test of this theory, Berkowitz examined how anger and the presence of weapons combine to make people more aggressive. Today, weapons are everywhere, and they are a source of intense political debate. Worldwide, roughly 650 million guns are in the hands of civilians. 2011. The same survey found that in the United States there are nearly 89 guns for every 100 citizens. According to Berkowitz, though, the presence of guns will lead to aggression only when combined with experiences of anger. To test his hypothesis, Berkowitz had male participants work on a series of intellectual problems with a male confederate, taking turns evaluating each other's performance by delivering shocks for performances that needed improvement. 1967. The participants worked on the problems first and then were shocked by the confederate. Unknown to the participants, The Confederate delivered shocks based on whether the participants had been assigned to a neutral condition or an anger condition, not based on their actual performance. The Confederate shocked those assigned to the neutral condition just one time, and those assigned to the anger condition 7 times. The participant then watched the Confederate work on the problems and provided feedback to the Confederate. The participant did so under one of 3 conditions. In a no-object condition, no objects were near the shock machine. In a neutral object condition, badminton rackets and shuttlecocks were near the shock machine. In a gun condition, a revolver and a shotgun lay near the shock machine. Rather unusual experimental props, to say the least. As you can see in Figure 13.4, the presence of guns made participants more aggressive only when they were also angered by the Confederates' actions, that is, after being shocked 7 times in the anger condition, in further support of the point that the presence of guns alone does not trigger aggression. A more recent study found that hunters don't become more aggressive when presented with images of guns, probably because they construe guns as objects for recreation and fun rather than for violence. 2005. Figure 13.4. Anger, weapons, and aggression. When people are angry and in the presence of weapons, they behave more aggressively. Okay, so it's a side-by-side bar graph. On the x-axis are no object, badminton racket, and guns. And on the y-axis is number of shocks given from 0 to 7. And the pairs of bars are a set of no anger and a set of anger. Okay, so when there is no object and there is no anger, the participants give 3 shocks and they give 5 shocks when they are angry. When there's a badminton racket next to the shock machine and the participants have no anger, they don't give any shocks. But when they are angry, they will give 5 shocks. So that's the same as having no object. And when there's a handgun and shotgun next to the shock machine, when participants experience no anger, they give 2.5 shocks. But when they are in the anger condition, having been shocked 7 times, they will shock 6 times. In the other object conditions, they will only shock 5 times. Box 13.4, focus on sports. The effect of uniform color on aggression. The tendency to act more aggressively when a weapon is nearby reinforces a core lesson of social psychology, the situationist message that seemingly small changes in the environment, such as the presence of a weapon, can have a substantial impact on behavior. This tendency also raises the question of whether other environmental cues might foster or inhibit aggression. For example, might the clothes people wear influence how they behave, including whether they behave aggressively? Is it possible that the menacing black shirts worn by Hitler's SS, Schutzstaffel, made it easier for them to brutalize the populace of conquered lands? Support for such a possibility comes from research on the effect of uniform color on aggressiveness in professional sports. Frank and Gilovich, 1988. The investigators began by examining the penalty records of all teams in American professional football, the NFL, and ice hockey, the NHL, from 1970 to 1985. As shown in Figure 13.3, the black uniformed teams consistently ranked near the top in penalties every year. As pronounced as this tendency might be, however, it can't predict whether wearing black actually causes players to be more aggressive. There are 2 other possibilities. First, because of some negative stereotypes involving the color black, such as black being the typical dress of movie villains, players in black uniforms may look more intimidating even if they play no differently than players on other teams who aren't wearing black. Thus, players in black uniforms may be more likely than others to be penalized for marginal infractions. 7. The finding may simply be a selection effect, that is, the general managers of certain teams, believing that aggressiveness pays off in victories, may both recruit particularly aggressive players and, incidentally, give them black uniforms to foster an aggressive image. The latter interpretation, however, can be ruled out. By a convenient twist of fate, several teams switched uniforms from non-black to black during the period under investigation, and all experienced a corresponding increase in penalties. One team, the NHL's Pittsburgh Penguins, changed uniform colors in the middle of a season, so the switch wasn't accompanied by any changes in players, coaches, or front office personnel. Nevertheless, the Penguins averaged 8 penalty minutes in the blue uniforms they wore before the switch and 12 penalty minutes in the black uniforms they wore after, a 50% increase. Follow-up laboratory experiments have provided support for both perceptions of aggressiveness and actual aggressiveness of players dressed in black. Thus, the tendency for black uniform teams to draw so many penalties appears to be the joint effect of a bias on the part of referees and a tendency for players wearing black to act more aggressively. But does wearing black always make people more aggressive? Probably not. The effect seems to be limited to contexts that are already associated with confrontation and aggression. The black clothing worn by Catholic clerics and Hasidic Jews, for example, may not make them more aggressive, but the black shirts worn by Hitler's SS might very well have contributed to their brutality. Figure 13.3, Uniform Color and Aggression. A. The Pittsburgh Steelers, wearing black uniforms, were known for their aggressive play. B. Points on the graph of penalty records represent the difference between the average ranking of the black uniform teams and the average to be expected based on chance alone. Dotted horizontal line at 0. Okay, so this is a graph of the residuals. So on the x-axis you have season, 1970 to 1984, and on the y-axis you have actual versus chance ranking from -4 to 8. One set of dots is connected for the NFL and one set of dots is connected for the NHL. Okay, so that you can see the residuals are mostly above the 0 dotted line for the correspondence based on chance alone. So because the correlation is positive for most of these NHL teams wearing black and NFL teams from 1970 to 1984, you can see that there is a correlation and a positive correlation between wearing black and number of penalty records. Dehumanization. Acts of aggression often go hand in hand with a particularly dangerous construal process known as dehumanization, the attribution of non-human characteristics to other people. Studies of escalating conflict and genocide regularly find that dehumanization fuels extreme violence. During the Rwandan genocide, the Hutus referred to the Tutsis as cockroaches. The Nazis described the Jews as lice. During the 18th century slave trade, so the 1700 slave trade, Europeans referred to the Africans they captured, sold, and killed as brutes and beasts. Hate crimes against gay men are often justified with dehumanizing rhetoric. One of the fastest growing targets of violent hate crimes, the homeless, are frequently dehumanized as animals. Even in more peaceful times, dehumanization arises in more subtle forms. You might hear a political pundit refer to an infestation of undocumented immigrants, who are further dehumanized by being referred to as illegals or aliens, or a candidate he doesn't like as robotic. Dehumanization can unleash aggression for the simple reason that it's easier to harm people when they seem less human, less like ourselves. For example, dehumanization plays a role in bullying behavior and in condoning police violence against African Americans. In a study of sexual violence, Redman and Mesher, 2012, identified men who were more likely to dehumanize women according to how quickly they paired the concept of woman with concepts such as animal and instinct. Men who were more likely to dehumanize women in this way reported that they would harass women sexually, that if no one would ever find out about it, they would force a woman to have sex, and that women on occasion deserve to be raped. Dehumanization, the attribution of non-human characteristics and denial of human qualities to groups other than one's own. One factor that increases the likelihood of dehumanization is loyalty to valued social groups. When we feel strongly committed to a group, whether a political party, an ethnic group, or a sports team, we are more disposed to dehumanize outgroup members. In one survey of over 180 groups in developing countries, tribes characterized by powerful in-group loyalty and a strong sense of we feeling were more likely to dehumanize other tribes and act in violent fashion against them. 2006. Nazi practices. The pain experiments the Nazis performed on Jews during the Holocaust are an extreme example of dehumanization. Shockingly, even rather benign feelings of social connection to some people increase the likelihood of dehumanizing others. Here the thinking is that although feeling socially connected brings us closer to people within our group, it creates greater distance from those who are different from us, making dehumanization more likely. In one study guided by this idea, students who were asked to recall a time of feeling connected to another person attributed less human-like mental states, such as empathy and moral concern, to outgroups such as the wealthy or the poor. 2012. In a clever extension of this work, when participants reported their attitudes while sitting next to a friend, thus feeling socially connected, as opposed to sitting next to a stranger, they were more likely to dehumanize non-U.S. citizens who were detained for security reasons, and to more strongly endorse forms of torture, such as waterboarding and the application of electric shock. 2012. The psychology of shooting sprees. Elliot Rodger killed 6 people and injured 14 more near the campus of the University of California, Santa Barbara. His violence was fueled by a hatred of women and disgust at interracial couples. Distancing from the causes of aggression. How might we avoid the pernicious tendencies associated with anger and dehumanization? One recommendation comes from the work of Ethan Cross and Özlem Ayduk, 2017, who propose that getting some distance from anger makes people more peaceful in contexts that might otherwise trigger aggression. Any experience of anger can be recalled from the original point of view, as it was initially experienced, or from a distance. 2008. To view our anger from a distance, we could, for example, think of the frustrating event as just one moment in time or as a single episode within a much longer relationship, or even as if it were part of a movie or novel. Construing potentially angering situations in each of these ways allows us to attain some distance from our feelings, and research suggests that doing so is a good thing. In one study, participants were asked to think about a time that had made them angry. 2008. Half of them were told to immerse themselves in the experience and vividly feel it in the present moment. The other half, those in the distance condition, were told to look at the experience from a distance as if they were watching themselves in a movie. Those participants who distanced themselves from their anger showed less fight or flight increases in blood pressure and reported a greater sense of calm. In a similar vein, when people look at conflicts from a more distant perspective by imagining what the situation will be like a year from now, as opposed to taking in an immersed here and now point of view, they tend to blame others less and are more forgiving. 2016. Negative characterizations. During wartime, dehumanization can be found in all kinds of publications. This is a page from a 1938 Nazi children's book. The picture's caption reads, "Just look at these guys. The louse-infested beards, the filthy protruding ears, those stained fatty clothes. Jews often have an unpleasant Swedish odor. If you have a good nose, you can smell the Jews." Remarkably, when you ask people why they are upset, referring to them in the third person rather than the second person evokes less negative emotion. For example, if we ask Jennifer, "Why are you upset?" she will experience more negative emotion than if we ask her, "Why is Jennifer upset?" Both experience and research indicate that it's easier for people to reason calmly about other people's problems than their own. When people use their own names to think about the self, it prompts them to take an observer's perspective, to think about themselves as though they were someone else, albeit another person whose inner thoughts and feelings they have privileged access to. This practice often provides them with the psychological distance needed to calmly reason through stressful situations and come up with wiser solutions for them. Looking back, people's construals of situations can be crucial in determining whether they act aggressively. When any kind of stimulus triggers anger, we're more likely to act aggressively. Our tendency to dehumanize others can fuel aggression. We aren't prisoners of such hostile construals, however. When we step back from them and look at what's making us angry from a distance, we become less hostile and more calm.